Thank you. So forgive me, I'm not going to be talking a lot about architecture, but I am hopefully going to be talking about the experience of work that most of the people we're dealing with are going through. So I found myself particularly interested in work culture. As mentioned, I'd worked at Google, I'd worked through the acquisition of YouTube, and now I've spent a few years working at Twitter. And I think the point I'm going to make today is that sometimes tech firms can be guilty of misdirecting us, suggesting that they have the answers on improving work culture. And quite often, there's lots more to it, and there's lots more, I think, that we need to understand. So that's what I'm going to go into. I'm going to try and give a little bit of evidence that can inform some of the decisions we make and some of the actions we make with regard to the teams who work for us. Broadly, I think anyone who's looking at the world of work right now finds themselves in a situation where they observe these two big trends ongoing. There's two trends that are affecting people in the workplace. And the first trend is that trend that started probably 15 years ago, where a few of us will remember there was a moment where John came into the office and John had a BlackBerry. And it seemed like a remarkable day that John had this new device that purred and chirped and had all manner of lights on it. And the strange thing that happened from that is that we all looked at John's BlackBerry and thought this was going to be the way that we made work better. And the average working day in those 15 years since then has gone up from 7.5 hours a day to 9.5 hours a day. People swiping away emails on their sofa, people dealing with emails and messages on their commute. The average working day has gone up. And I think that wouldn't necessarily matter if the second megatrend that's affecting us wasn't so important. And the second trend is the one that maybe people in this room are starting to think of, but people outside this room really struggle to understand right now. And that's the arrival of machine learning and automation. And to a large extent, machine learning and automation is going to go into the areas of our job that are the most predictable, the most forecastable. We're going to find ourselves, human beings, moving away from those predictable parts of our job into the elements that require a bit of ingenuity, a bit of originality. I sort of hesitate to say it, but a bit of creativity. And the reason why those two trends matter in aggregate is that the evidence is really strongly. If we thought about stress levels like the signal on our mobile phone, on our cell phones, if we broke the signal on our mobile phone down into 4 chunks, if we considered stress like that, people who check their emails for 2 hours a day outside of work hours, 3/4 of those people are on 4 bars of stress. So we've created a system that's filled with stress. And the evidence really strongly, and I'm going to go through it today, is that stress kills our ability to do the requirement of the second trend, be creative. So stress and creativity live in opposition to each other. And unless we address those things, the future of work doesn't look good. Anytime someone talks about the arrival of machine learning or the arrival of robots, I always think of this tweet, which is the feeling when you realize the robots will steal your job. Right, so I'm going to go through 4 examples of how we might be looking into the wrong places and how we can improve work. And I'm going to choose these 4 people. You might be aware of Ferdinand Piëch, former CEO of VW. I'm going to also look at Elon Musk. The bottom left corner is Lloyd Wright. And I'm also going to look at Hastings. So I guess there's a couple of tech people there, but I'm just going to go into some of the examples. And the examples I'm going to look at for VW is stress, the issue of working hours for Elon Musk, open plan offices for Lloyd Wright, and Hastings' comment that Netflix is not a family. So I'm going to look into some of the ways that we're working now, some of the people talking to us about work, and the implication that will have on the experience of work. So the first one is to go into the Volkswagen story. And I think probably a lot of us know a little bit of this story, the Volkswagen Dieselgate affair, but I thought I'd just go through and see what we could draw, what elements we could draw for how modern work is evolving. And probably the thing that you're aware of is that Volkswagen set themselves the goal of being the biggest car manufacturer in the world about a decade ago. To do that, they needed to sell more cars in the US than Toyota or Ford. To do that, they needed a much better diesel engine than they currently had. Now, the challenge, that you may remember some of the details, the challenge was that the VW, the Volkswagen diesel engine, was failing emission standards. In certain states like California, it was about 5 or 6 times over the emission standards. Now, you'll remember that their solution to this was that they created a system where every time the car was being tested, every time the motor was being tested, it went into clean mode. And the strange thing about that is that when we've gone through and we've looked at this story, we really struggle because there never seemed to be an explicit order for people to break the rules. But this year, a book by a leading researcher, a woman called Amy Edmondson, went into some of the details of that affair, and she delved into some of the previous history involving the former CEO, Ferdinand Piëch. And one of the things that she observed was that he was renowned for shouting at workers. He was renowned for yelling in meetings. In fact, this was a different issue, but at a different time, she records this quotation. He yelled at some of his designers, "You have 6 weeks. I have all of your names. If we do not have good body fits in 6 weeks, I will replace all of you." And Amy Edmondson talks about this being an example of the absence of psychological safety. The interesting thing is, as we observe more and more examples of good workplace cultures, it seems like psychological safety seems to be the underpinning of the very best. So let me take a moment to explain psychological safety. And I mentioned someone before that was Amy Edmondson. Amy Edmondson started her work studying hospitals. She went into hospitals and she was fascinated to see whether she could observe where the best teams existed. She drew a lot of metrics, she gathered a lot of data, and she was really fascinated because it seemed that she could prove which were the best teams. And all of the data seemed to correlate in the same direction. And just as she was finishing her work, she added one more field of data. And that was the amount of drug errors, the amount of medicine errors that the teams were making. She was pretty certain all the evidence was pointing in one direction. But in fact, the medical evidence came out in a very different direction. It seemed rather than making the fewest mistakes with medicine, with drugs, the best teams were making the most mistakes. And she was really confused by that. Why would the best teams be making more mistakes than the worst teams? She went back and she interviewed some of the nurses, some of the doctors involved. And she came to the conclusion the best teams weren't making more mistakes. The best teams were admitting to making more mistakes. Really fundamental difference. Because if you're in a trusting environment and you make a mistake and you go and tell someone you've made a mistake, then you know that your boss and the team around you will respond in a certain way. If you're in an untrusting environment and you make a mistake, the team around you will respond in a hostile way. And that's what she observed in the hospitals. That when there's psychological safety, people are free to do their best work without fear of being judged. But I guess the other thing that comes to the heart of Ferdinand Piëch being famous for shouting at people is the impact that stress has on our creativity. And this was some work done by a pioneering neuroscientist called Jaak Panksepp. And Jaak Panksepp studied rats. He was really fascinated with the way that the system of thinking in a rat's brain worked. Here's what he discovered. He discovered that there were 7 motivations, there were 7 systems in a rat's brain. And the most dominant, it seemed, was the fear system. But there are also other systems. One of the things that rats have very strongly is they have a desire to discover new things, to explore. He called it the seeking system. The desire to find new things. It's why if you've ever found yourself against rats, they seem incredibly inventive at finding ways to escape. Here's what Jaak Panksepp wanted to understand. He wanted to understand, would the fear system or the seeking system win in a competition? So here's what he did. He observed that when we put two rats in a cage, they exhibit about 50 instances of this seeking system. It's what we might sort of call creativity, the desire to discover new things. They observe about 50 instances of that in 5 minutes. Then he put a piece of cat hair in the cage with them. They went from 50 instances of seeking, 50 instances of creativity, to 0. Fear and stress kills our capacity to be inventive. The interesting thing about that is that if you take the cat hair away, if you clean the cage, if you return the rats to a cleaned cage, even then there's a stress hangover. It seems to last about 3 or 4 days. After about 3 or 4 days, they get back to being about 35 episodes of seeking. So stress seems to not only kill our capacity to explore and experiment and create, but also it seems to last a few days. And there's no shortage of evidence on this. Here's a quotation from Gregory Burns from Emory University. The most concrete thing that neuroscience tells us is when the fear system of the brain is active, exploratory activity and risk-taking are turned off. So back to VW, back to Ferdinand Piëch. When he was shouting at the members of his team, he wasn't activating them into being more creative. He was doing exactly the opposite. He was causing a situation where they weren't going to find the best solutions. They would start working around how could they find a solution with the answers they had. So we'll sort of draw a line through what we can learn from Ferdinand Piëch's approach to management. I want to take a look now at Elon Musk. Elon Musk is one of the most esteemed and well-regarded innovators and entrepreneurs in the world. Everyone has an opinion on Elon Musk. And this is one of the things that he was out saying a few months ago. He did a TV interview where he talked about his own working practices. He likes to work about 100 hours a week. But he said this comment, he said, "No one changed the world on 40 hours a week." Really interesting perspective, because I was fascinated with that. A lot of young people especially, look to Elon Musk. So is he modeling that they need to work 100 hours a week like he does to be successful? Well, in fact, there's a lot of research on this. Here's some work by a guy called John Penkerville at Stanford University. And what he found was that if we work more than about 45, 50 hours a week, our total productivity for that week starts to decline. So the following week, if we work 50, 55 hours, we'll produce less than if we work 50 hours this week. But that's physical labor. That was physical labor. This is working with our sort of muscles. I was interested in what the evidence is for us working with our minds. Well, in fact, there's a lot of science on this as well. The science of this, if you want to go and search on the internet, the science of this is often called ego depletion. The best summary I can give you of ego depletion comes from the following quotation from a book by a guy called Daniel Levitin. And I want you to think about this quotation. It's the most words I'll show on a slide, but I want you to think about this quotation for what it actually means for how the human mind works. He says, "Our brains are configured to make a certain number of decisions per day. And once we reach that limit, we can't make any more regardless of how important they are." So that's the summary, that's the science of ego depletion. Now you might find some examples of this. You might find you come home from work one day and your partner asks you something and you just need a minute, you can't quite think about it. Or you might find yourself going to answer an email in the evenings and it takes you 4 or 5 attempts to actually think about what you want to say. The evidence suggests that, albeit that we can get a degree of renewal if we go for a walk, if we take a break, we can get a bit of freshness back. But our brains are far more like the battery on our phone than we would like to admit. Rather than us being able to work 100 hours a week, our brains are actually finite, and we need to respect them. Now, a lot of people might have examples, maybe when you were studying, where you worked late into the night and you studied hard. But what you forget about those stories is that you slept all the next day, and then you had a 6-week vacation, and you recovered, and your body was allowed the chance to actually recover. If we think far more about our brains being like this, it actually helps us understand how we can more actively service our productivity. So on the basis of that, I'm going to draw a line through what Elon Musk can teach us as well. The next person is Lloyd Wright. Incredible profile photograph. I don't think anyone would put this photograph on LinkedIn now. But Frank Lloyd Wright was famous for open plan offices. In fact, he sort of was regarded as being strongly against walls, rooms, desks, meeting rooms, anything that sort of stopped there being the openness of space. But the interesting thing is that over the last few years, we've been able to gather a lot of evidence about what open plan offices actually do to our working environments. One of the biggest things that changes when we move from offices to open plan is that people, their dislike of their colleagues goes up by 3/4. People hate their colleagues when they're exposed to them. But other things that go up, the volume of emails goes up 2/3. So we find that even though open plan is meant to be the space where we all get together and be creative, it seems to have the opposite effect. The best evidence I can find of the impact of what an open plan environment does to our work was from a piece of work a few years ago called the Coding Wargames. And the Coding Wargames was a piece of research that took 500 researchers, 500 computer software engineers across 100 different companies. And it gave them a challenge. They had to make a medium-sized program to solve a specific task. They were told they could build in any coding language they wanted. They could be any level of seniority and experience. The only things that were important was that they would work in their normal workplace environment. That was it. The interesting thing about the results for that is that the best results were 10 times better than the worst results. The best results were 2.5 times better than the average results. And when the researchers went to look, what was the thing that determined what was the secret of the success? They discovered that the level of experience of the software engineers had no impact. The level of seniority had no impact. The only thing that impacted the quality of their work was that those who did the best results described their working environment as acceptably private. The ones who had the worst results described their working environment as being subject to constant interruptions. That's interesting. Anyone who finds themselves in an open plan office will recognize that. Constant interruptions is one of the things that characterizes most of our teams' working environments. So, to a large extent, we've created a version of work which is creating immense difficulties for our team to do their best work. So we'll draw a line through Frank Lloyd Wright. The final one I want to examine in terms of the misdirections that we get is Reed Hastings. Now, a few of you might be familiar with the Netflix culture document. The Netflix culture document was produced probably 10, 15 years ago now. And it was Netflix's attempt to describe why their culture, why their working system was different to everyone else. The day they published it, they said their job applications halved because it included statements like, if you achieve an A for effort in your end-of-term scorecard, an A for effort but a B for performance, we're going to pay you to leave the company. They also included this comment, which said, we want employees to know we're a team, not a family, meaning we should feel no fondness to each other, we just work together. So I was really interested in that. Is there no sense of teams feeling connected to each other that matters to them doing their best jobs? How important is the sense of belongingness to us doing a good job? Obvious place to start on that is to look into the history of the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II. Now, Frederick II was really, in the 12th century, was a pioneer ahead of his time. Because we'll often come to technology conferences and we'll hear about A/B tests. But Frederick II was doing A/B tests 8 centuries ago. One of his A/B tests was he was interested in how much food would be digested by different activities. So he took 2 local village peasants. He gave them both a big evening meal, and he instructed one of them to go immediately to bed. The other one was to go on a hunting expedition. When the huntsman returned, he wanted to see who had digested more of their food. Unfortunately, at the time, there was no easy way to do that, so he killed them both, cut them open, and had a look inside to see who digested more food. So he was an A/B tester before his time, never recognized for it. Another way that he did A/B test, he was convinced that in the same way that dogs bark and cats meow and birds chirp, humans must have a native language that they would speak if they weren't taught the languages that humans have created. So he took some newborn babies from their mums and he gave them to his nurses. And he instructed the nurses really clearly, don't look at the babies, don't talk to the babies, do nothing other than feed the babies and change them, keep them warm. He wanted to know how long it would be before their native language arose. And the only problem with that experiment is that deprived of any affection, the babies died. Really fascinating. So we've come to the understanding of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that we have food and shelter first, then belongingness. And every time that researchers have tried to understand the relative importance of belongingness, it appears not to be a second thought after food and shelter. It seems to coexist. A big paper by two researchers called Mark Leary and Roy Baumeister found this. Much of what human beings do is done in the service of belongingness. Belongingness is as important as food and shelter. And this has a big bearing on how our employees experience work. If we don't pay regard to belongingness, it seems to strongly affect the employee experience. One of the biggest surveys ever conducted into this suggested that the absence of belongingness is a bigger cost on our health than obesity. The researcher here, Julianne Holt-Lundstadt, in the US, she said that not having a sense of belongingness, feeling lonely, is the equivalent of smoking about 15 cigarettes a day. Interesting. So when we're creating workplaces, to say that our team shouldn't feel any fondness for each other, shouldn't feel any connection, could well be a mistake. So we'll draw a line through Reed Hastings. But I wanted to give you some evidence and examples of how we can actually set about improving work. And I start from the perspective here that I was in an environment where my workers at Twitter were showing extreme signs of burnout. Increasingly, it's probably one of the words of the year, increasingly we're seeing burnout across the whole of the workforce. One survey suggested that 50% of office workers are reporting feeling burnt out. It's even higher amongst hospital workers. We're seeing it everywhere. And it seems to be one of the consequences of us feeling like we need to never step away from our jobs. So I set about thinking, what can we do? And I wanted to find evidence for ways that we could make our teams fall in love with their jobs again. But here's what I found. There is actually two things that make us fall in love with our jobs, our lives, before anything else. So I'm going to give you those two. So I'm going to give you 7 ways that science is teaching us to be happier in our jobs. So here's number 1, the number 1 way to be happier, full stop, in your whole life. It's to sleep more. On the 51-point depression scale, Prozac moves you 1.8 points on the depression scale. A good night's sleep moves you 6 points. So a good night's sleep is remarkably effective. The leading sleep scientist in the world says that if I was to tell you something that reduced your chance of heart disease, reduced your chance of degenerative brain disease, it reduced your chance of getting a common cold, it improved your attractiveness, and it made you happier, you'd be asking how much it costs. And the fact that we argue about the amount of sleep we get seems strange. The leading sleep scientist, Matthew Walker, also tells a fascinating story, because sleep scientists were really intrigued by those of us who claim to only need 4 or 5 hours sleep a night. You might know some of these people who say that they can get by on 4 hours. And the biggest survey ever conducted of these people was performed in New York. A large group of these people was invited in to undergo an fMRI brain scan. You're familiar with these things, sort of big machines that you have to be put onto a bed and then slid in. 3/4 of the people who claimed to only need 4 hours sleep a night fell asleep in the machine. And the conclusion was that we might tell ourselves we don't need sleep, but there seems to be strong evidence that we might be fibbing. We might be misdirecting ourselves. Number 2 way to be happier is to get happier friends. I recognize that that's a difficult one. If the world is split into, now language-wise, I'm not sure if this will translate, but drains and radiators. Radiators are those people who emanate energy, they're sort of positive. That friend that every time you meet them, you smile, that's a radiator. Drains, they're the people who sort of, if you're stuck in a meeting with them, if you're stuck on a plane next to them, a long journey next to them, you just feel every part of you, it feels like gravity's stronger, every part of you is less happy. And it seems that there's strong evidence that the more time we spend with radiators actually makes us happy. And the only issue with that is if you're married to a drain. So let me give you some real examples now of how we can improve work. So the first thing is to understand how human cognition actually works. And I think this is really instructive for the way that we can try and rebuild a new version of work. If we were to do a very simple exploration into neuroscience, one of the first things we'd learn is these 3 networks of cognition. The first network of cognition is called the executive attention network. It's when we're writing an email on our phones, it's the executive attention network that is writing that email. It's sort of the main point of our focus. But there's a second network, and that runs in conjunction with the executive attention network. That's called the salience network. So maybe we're writing a text on our phone and we're walking down the street, but the salience network will make sure we don't bump into anyone. It's a different network, but it operates at the same time. But there's a third network, and it seems it's the one that we most often ignore. We neglect, we don't think it's important. When we put people into brain scanners, we observe this network called the default mode, or the default network. We observe it when people stop doing things. Often we'll say to them, "What are you doing now?" Because the rest of your brain is lit up. "What are you doing now?" And they'll say, "I was thinking of nothing. I wasn't thinking. I was bored." And it seems that when we explore when human beings have their best ideas, it's not when we're in that active state. It's not when we're in the executive attention network. It's not when we're sitting at our laptop trying to think of an idea. It's rather when we get up and we go to have a cup of coffee, when we go and we walk and an idea will come to us. It's called the default mode, And here's the interesting thing, is that next time you have a good idea, I'd ask you to think about this. Were you sitting frowning into your laptop, or rather were you doing something else? Most of us describe situations. I chatted to someone who said, "I have all my best ideas walking my dog." I chatted to someone else. He said, "I have all my best ideas on the train home, staring out the window." My favorite example is the screenwriter Aaron Sorkin. He wrote A Few Good Men. He wrote Moneyball. He wrote The Social Network. Incredibly successful. He also wrote the West Wing TV show. Incredibly successful, famous for incredibly witty dialogue. He realized he was having all his best ideas not staring into his computer screen, but in the shower. He had a shower installed in the corner of his office. He says he has 8 to 10 showers a day. Interesting, right? But if we activate our best ideas when we're in this state of unfocus, when we're in this state of boredom, do you remember boredom? Do you remember, literally, think now, do you remember boredom? Do you remember being bored as a kid? Hours and hours waiting for just anything to happen, waiting for someone to invent the internet, waiting for just something to take place. And it seems that we activate our thinking for our brain. Cognition seems to take place in those moments. Good ideas seem to take place. Now, if you've created a version of modern work like the rest of us, which is filled with meetings, is filled with emails, the question has to be, where's the room for the thinking in the spaces between that? And understanding that can help us start building an experience of work that seems more satisfying. Secondly, understanding how we collaborate together and how we work. And quite often, when anyone is thinking about the future of work, it's inevitable. Our brain starts thinking about situations where people are dialed in from remote locations on their laptop. But in fact, there seems to be a lot of evidence that suggests that our experience and the way that we actually interact with each other often requires far more physicality, far more presence than we might expect. Here's an interesting experiment. This was done by a researcher at Oxford University, a very famous researcher called Robin Dunbar. And he took a group of rowers. So you can see rowers there. He did 2 experiments. One where he put a group of people on rowing machines on their own. Second, he took a group of rowers and he got them to row like on the boat. He got them to row in sync with each other. That's it. He wanted to see, was there any difference? Here's what he discovered, that they did about the same amount of physical exercise. But at the end of the experiment, he checked the pleasure hormones, the endorphin levels in their bodies. The rowers who'd rowed in time with each other had twice the endorphin levels of the ones who hadn't. Why? Because when we feel connected to other people, it transforms the experience. And you might observe this if you've ever exercised with someone, or people who dance together see this. Audiences who laugh together see this, that when we feel connected to other people, it seems to enhance the experience. And we see no shortage of evidence of it. Let me give another example. When human beings feel connected to other human beings, it has a measurable impact. So here's another example. And this is taking unmarried couples who live in different cities in the US. Researchers wanted to understand why some couples who lived in different cities survived long times not living together and other couples didn't. They looked into 40,000 couples. What they discovered was the couples who stayed together phoned each other every day to talk about trivial things. That's interesting because we've got into a world where we believe if someone sends a text, an SMS, a WhatsApp, a Facebook message, we believe that that's a substitute. And it seems it isn't. Human beings require far more human connection than we might regard. And understanding that is a really critical element of making sure we engineer work in a human way. I'll give you another example. So the understanding the importance of downtime and how we relax. So this is probably taking the Swedish tradition of fika, of sort of coffee and cake, to an afternoon coffee break. And this was some work done by a really remarkable company called HumaniZe out of the US. They build badges, sort of like the badges that you're wearing today, that enable interactions to be tracked between people. They also allow they allow interactions electronically to be measured. And they've given us an incredible amount of data to improve how offices are calibrated. And they staged one fascinating intervention, which was they took workers working in a call center and they tried to see if they could change the experience of work for those people by changing just very small elements of their job. So this was workers working in a call center. And imagine this is a call center now. We're all in a big call center. Now, historically, breaks might have been done one by one. Now, they said, how about if the group of people sitting here go on a break simultaneously? Will that affect the experience? So here's what they found. It was a 15-minute intervention. And the first thing to say is that this was a break that these people were already having. So this was zero cost. Even though it was 15 minutes, they were already having that break. But the next thing they noticed was this, that the stress levels of the people who went on the breaks together was 19% lower than the people who went on the breaks individually. Humanity brings us together and seems to radically change the experience that we're undergoing. When people go on a break together, they feel more connected, they feel less stressed. But here's what they hadn't expected. The performance levels of those people went up 23%. Now, to put that into context, that's more than a decade's extra experience. This extra capability of these workers was many years extra experience. And they tried to understand why. The reason why is that people would go on a break together and they would turn to each other and say, I've just had an immensely stressful call. And their colleague would say, when that happens, you should say this. Immediately solving the problems. But why does all of this matter? Because I guess it illustrates that when we feel connected to each other, we actually feel that the experience of work radically improves. And it's a cautionary note when any of us are thinking about the future of work being a lot of people dialing into a call remotely. it seems to lose something that, while we can't immediately see it, seems to have a measurable impact on our jobs. I'll give you 2 more examples. This one is really just understanding how we can change the experience of work from the very outset. And there's really strong evidence that when we feel that we're accepted into our workplaces, it permits us to be more inventive, it permits us to be more creative. Back to that example I said before, that when we feel stressed, we feel uncreative. If we can mitigate that, if we can reduce the stress levels, it seems to have a massive impact on improving work. So this was work done by a researcher, a professor at London Business School called Dan Cable. And he did a really interesting intervention where he went into, this was a tech call center again. I think we can learn a lot from these places. He went to a tech call center and he staged this as part of the induction process for new workers. He gave everyone, new workers, people who were sitting in groups of 5 or 6, he gave this exercise, and again it was a 15-minute exercise. So they asked the workers to answer this. What is unique about you that leads to your happiest times at work? Reflect on a specific time you were acting in the way you were born to act. So far, so simple. What they hadn't expected is quite often when you stage these research experiments, that you do a first experiment, you learn why that was a failure, and then you improve it. This was the very first experiment they did, but it seemed to have a remarkable impact. So this was a high turnover environment, but the people who went through this exercise, 3,000 individuals, so it was a big sample size. People who went through this exercise were 50% more likely to still be at the company after 12 months. The second part of the exercise is that they measured the customer satisfaction of people who'd been through this. The average satisfaction for the center was 62 out of 100. The workers who went through this was 73 out of 100. So if you put the numbers over each other, that's a 20% uplift from people doing this 15-minute intervention. And I think what you can learn from the last 2 examples is that actually very small interventions can have a big impact. If any of us, the last exercise saw a 23% increase in productivity, this saw a 20% increase in customer satisfaction. If any of us were able to deliver 20% growth next year, probably it's a big contribution to our year-on-year targets. And these interventions are not only free, but incredibly easy to do. It's just a good reminder, I think, that a lot of the way that we're learning how data can impact the workplace can have a very meaningful contribution to improving the experience of work. The final one I mentioned was, the final one is understanding how we belong. So I gave the cautionary note earlier about the importance of belongingness and how workplaces like Netflix maybe have disregarded that. In fact, there's a lot of research into this. One of the leading researchers on this is a woman called Sigal Barside from Wharton University in the US. And she spent a lot of time looking into teams that have a strong bond between them. She discovered that I think quite often it would be our instinct to think that a team that laughed together a lot, a team that had a lot of affinity together, it would be our prejudice to believe that that team was less rigorous. They were less focused on safety, on high results. But in fact, she discovered the opposite. Teams that had strong affection with each other, she describes it as companionate love. When teams feel a fondness with each other, they're in fact more accountable, they're more rigorous, they go out of their way to ensure that they maintain high standards for each other. And I think this is probably an important lesson as we're thinking about work. How can we engineer it in a more satisfying and rewarding way? I was really taken when I went into this. I'd always learned that there were times to laugh at work and there were times when we really shouldn't laugh at work. My former boss had told me that at times when you aren't hitting your numbers, you shouldn't be seen laughing at work. So I was really interested. What's the science of laughter? Really fascinating. One of the leading laughter experts in the world told me that there's around 75,000 academic papers into anxiety and depression. There's around 100 academic papers into laughter. Even though we do it so much, scientists are embarrassed to research it. But here's what he said to me. He said, laughter, when we go into workplaces, has a very strange role. Quite often, if you go into your workplace, you'll observe that when people laugh, if you look at what they've laughed at, it's actually not that funny. People will laugh at things like, it's Philip's turn. Well, good luck with that. Thank you. They'll laugh at things that aren't funny. The way he described it to me, an expert called Robert Provine, he said, laughter is humanity's bird song. Why? Because birds sing to get connectedness, and humans laugh to feel connected with each other. And once you understand that, you start understanding that actually there is a time to laugh, because when we laugh, we feel connected. And you remember I mentioned before the rowers, but I mentioned that people who laugh together feel connected with each other. It seems that laughter performs that same function, but it also does a lot more. When we look into a wonderful writer, a guy called Lawrence Gonzalez, who studied survivors. So these are people whose plane crashes in the jungle, or they get stranded up a mountain, or their boat gets lost in the ocean. And some of these people survive. And when he's gone to look at survivors, there's one thing that seems to characterize those who survive. And they were the people who laughed every day at how ridiculous their situation was. Why? Because laughter seems to be incredible at resetting our resilience. When we laugh about things, we're able to cope and move on. So my boss, who told me now's not the time to be seen laughing, actually might have been misdirecting me. That when we're in bad times, it seems that laughter is incredibly powerful. And it's back to this sense of companionate love. When we feel a connection with the people around us, it often empowers, it often motivates us to do our best work. So I mentioned at the outset that I was really fascinated with, firstly, how the modern world of work is going to evolve. I think it's a genuine consideration that any employer is facing right now. How do they deal with the burnout levels that we're experiencing? For the first time, we're in modern workforces where workers are feeling willing to admit that they can't cope. But the affliction of that seems to be affecting more and more of our workers. And that was the experience I had. So 4 years ago, I found myself in a situation where there was a massive burnout crisis at my work. 40% of my workers left in 1 year. Incredible. When you hit that number, you often find, firstly, it tends to be like wildfires. It spreads. You find yourself constantly thinking, who else is going to leave? But it also forces you to address some of the underlying issues. And it forces you to think really seriously about how can I make this workplace better for my workers. And what I found was there's no shortage of evidence. There's no shortage of evidence from some of the way that technology is evolving. There's no shortage of evidence from the indications we're getting from neuroscience and psychology. But we need to start bringing some of that evidence into the way we're working. A lot of the evidence from neuroscience and psychology is out there, but it's not reaching people in their jobs. And as any of us in this room today thinking, how can technology enhance the working experience? How can we find our way to improving work? It seems that there's actually a very good foundation to some of those explorations. So I just want to remind you some of the things that I took us through. Firstly, the importance of understanding how we think. Back to that default mode, the thinking of Aaron Sorkin and his realization he was having his best ideas in the shower. Unless we give space in our working zones, we can eliminate our ability to have our best creative ideas. I remember hearing Paul Allen, one of the founders of Microsoft, and he described thinking as splitting into two zones, a maker's mindset and a manager's mindset. A maker's mindset, he said, needs blocks of 3 or 4 hours of space to just think. A manager's mindset can have 15-minute interactions. But the danger of mixing the two is that if you put a 30-minute meeting in the middle of a maker's diary, it doesn't just reduce the maker's diary, it destroys it. And understanding how we think seems to be really critical as we're going to imagine a new, more creative version of work. Understanding how we team. You remember the rowers? Their experience was enhanced by feeling connected to each other. The importance of us feeling like we're part of something bigger than ourselves. Then taking that and thinking about those call center workers, actually that sense of connectedness seemed to be one of the reasons why they ended up being more productive and less stressed. Settling, you remember the new workers? What can you do? When was the time that you were acting in the way you were born to act? It seems to be one of the things that when people feel adapted into an organization, they seem capable of doing their best work. And the final one, the importance of belongingness, pushing back on that notion of Reed Hastings saying that we're a team, not a family. When we feel connected to the people around us, it's really critical. It's inevitable that any of us in the room today, when we're thinking about the future of work, we're going to think that the future of work lies in technology. And that's the cautionary note I would give. I would say, yes, by all means, technology will be an enabler, but the secrets when we're thinking about the future of work are those people who understand that the future of work lies in unlocking greater powers for humanity. The future of work truly requires us to think about humanity and lean into it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce Daisley, for at least 5 to 7 ways to love work again. To be honest, sleep I'd like very much, but of course also human connection and belongingness. Ladies and gentlemen, we still have a couple of more minutes left to go into a short Q&A session, if it's okay with you, Bruce.
Of course.
Yeah, of course. So, ladies and gentlemen, use the chance and the time to ask questions that want to be answered by Bruce Daisley. Wir haben bestimmt irgendwo unsere helfenden Hände mit den Mikros, ne? Do we have our...
There's one over there.
Yeah, I'm trying to, maybe, okay.
Sorry, the question is rather long. In organizations, there are different teams, and for example, sales and all kinds of IT teams and all that, so they attract different type of people. So do you think that these rules that you just, or these items that you said are just sort of universal, or should they be somehow, changed to meet the subset of the people, not trying to stereotype, but for example, salespeople and IT people are sort of different type of people.
I think to a large extent, it's understood a little bit by that Paul Allen mindset, that the manager's mindset is to a large extent the way that salespeople operate. So they're not necessarily managers, but they're breaking work into 15-minute short interactions. It's very executional. Often there isn't a big requirement for inventiveness, imagination. There's a degree of sort of adapting things, but it's the manager's mindset. But the maker's mindset is very different. And this might be someone who's a software engineer, someone who's trying to create something. And I think the mistake we often feel is trying to create one rule that works for both. If someone is often if you chat to people who work in this creative environment where they're building things, they'll often describe, firstly, if you ask them when they've had a good day at work, they'll describe making progress in something meaningful. But secondly, they require long periods of quiet concentration. And I think somewhere along the way, a lot of us started to believe that creativity was a team activity. And it can have team elements to it. The more that those people talk, it seems to be that they can produce more. But the talking needs to be in managed moments. It's not continuously talking. It's periods of long concentration and then going to share their work with each other. And I think that's what we sometimes forget. We forget that even the best creativity starts in isolation, then is forged into a higher state with the cooperation of others. I think that's the critical consideration, really.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, first of all, for the nice presentation and talk. My question is, you have now shown us 4 persons which have some flaws, which are incredibly successful. In your research, have you also found persons being successful but being perfect, in the sense how you describe it?
It seems that when... here's a strange thing that we understand well, that power is disinhibiting. So if you ever watch a leader, a boss, they'll often be more flamboyant with their language, they'll often put their feet on the table, they'll often speak in a louder tone. Power is disinhibiting. So the opposite of that is the lack of power is inhibiting, meaning that when people are subservient, when they're doing junior roles, when they're less able to call the shots. Power is disinhibiting. And what we discover is that seems to have a big impact on their experience of work. So when workers feel like they can't make decisions, when workers feel like their voice isn't listened to, it actually has the impact on their whole experience of work of making them repressed and depressed. And here's what we find is that organizations that remove people from those constraints, people that allow workers to feel like they've got control and autonomy, seem to be the ones where workers do their best work. Now, quite often we find that the bigger that organizations are, the bigger that teams are, the bigger that companies are, the less control that individual workers can have. But there are some organizations who go out of their way to ensure that people feel empowered, that they can make decisions, they can get more done, they have more autonomy. So there are examples. I'm reluctant to sort of pinpoint specific ones, because I think quite often what we see when we're sold these stories is a degree of marketing. But organizations that try and give their workers a degree of autonomy and a degree of control seem to be the ones where the working experience is the most satisfying.
One more question, yes?
What do you recommend for people like me who are not in a C-level job to do if their workplaces do not fulfill those criteria? So open office, very little room to shape the future of the company, maybe little psychological safety. Should we just get another job?
Yeah, I'm sorry to start the day so badly for you. I think this is the experience of work for a lot of us. This is the experience where we don't have control, we don't have autonomy, we find ourselves in big open plan offices. And the challenge that I found with my workers was that all of these things were contributing to them feeling burnt out by their job, and they had nowhere to go. My feeling is personally that bosses, C-levels, will never change a lot of these things because they don't witness and they don't observe them. So it's about people. I was really inspired. I went into a few organizations where low status people, where junior people had changed part of their team culture, part of the working environment for the 30, 40, 50 people around them by starting discussions, by saying, let's stop weekend emails. Let's make sure that we stop doing this. Let's start taking lunch breaks. Let's make sure that we try and work no more than 40 hours a week. And those small actions don't necessarily need the permission of the boss, but they can have a very big impact on our own day-to-day experience.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'd say thank you very much to Bruce Daisley. Have a round of applause.